Okay, everyone, it's 2:30. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the Economic Prosperity Committee meeting to order at 2:30 p.m. And before I start, on behalf of the City of Colwood, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all gathered and meeting on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Songhees, Esquimalt, Wasanich, whose historic relationships with this land continue to this day. Under our new rules of engagement, I'd like to move on here and go. I would like to move approval of the agenda. Is there any questions or discussions on the agenda? Seeing none, I will call the question. Are there any opposed? Again, seeing none, the motion is approved. I'd like to move to the adoption of the past minutes of the April 12th, 2021 meeting. Are there any questions, discussion items, errors or omissions on the minutes? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Anybody opposed to the adoption of the minutes? Seeing none, the motion is approved. And I understand there is no public participation today. So I'll get on with new business item 5. And today we're going to have a presentation on our favorite subject on parking and specifically on parking economics, how to manage or maximize value through efficient parking management. I'll call upon Ian Borhill, Director of Community Planning, to introduce our speaker. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd also mention that our Manager of Building Services and Bylaw Enforcement is here with me, just off camera here. So if you'd like to direct questions to either of us, we're both here on the call. So today we've got a presentation that was intended to support Council's consideration of the on-street parking policy that staff have been directed to develop, as well as the off-street parking bylaw and variance policy that's before Council tonight, with a recommendation from the Committee of the Whole to forward the draft bylaw and policy on for public consultation. So as Chair Kobayashi mentioned, today we have Todd Littman, Executive Director of the Victoria Transportation Policy Institute. Todd is the founder of the Transportation Institute, which is an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovative solutions to transportation problems. His work, as it's stated on the Transportation Institute's website, is intended to expand the range of impacts and options considered in transportation decision-making, improve evaluation methods, and make specialized technical concepts accessible to a larger audience. So very germane to the work before the city right now. His research is used worldwide in transportation planning and policy analysis. And Mr. Littman has worked on numerous studies to evaluate transportation costs, benefits, and innovations. He's authored numerous books, including Parking Management Best Practices, a comprehensive manual on innovative management solutions to parking problems. He's worked in more than 24 different countries on every continent except Antarctica. And you may recall Mr. Littman from supporting through presentations he made on the city's behalf to support the development of our transportation master plan, as well as official community plan. So with that, I'd like to welcome Todd Littman to Colwood and jump into the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Greetings, and thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to proceed to my slideshow. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions as we go along. So I'm going to focus on what you could broadly call parking economics. And really the goal, I think, what you're interested in and what I can share are some ideas to extract the maximum value from your parking facilities, making each space work as hard as it can. So let's see what that means. Let's So I probably don't have to tell you, parking problems are among the most common conflicts that local officials and businesses and residents face. I'm sure you've all suffered the slings and arrows of people unhappy with what you're doing with parking. So let's see how we can make sense of it. From a transportation or land use planning perspective, it's useful to understand what's going on, looking at it from the big picture. And that is one way to think of this is that we're really changing the way we think about parking problems and the solutions that should be considered, what we call a new paradigm. So the old paradigm, which is pretty well integrated into our current planning practices, assumes that as much as possible, parking should be free or at least very cheap and as abundant as possible. That is, it assumes that more is always better. And so for most of the last century, or at least the last half century, cities have required generous amounts of parking in developments and have done everything they can to maximize the amount of parking that's available on street, designing streets with a maximum number of parking spaces, and in general, making that parking available for free. And I'm not saying that's bad, but there are many situations where it is inefficient. It is probably not the best way to maximize the value of that resource. So over the last decade or so, there's been quite a movement toward a more, you could call it a more integrated or more efficiency-oriented parking paradigm, which is really looking at how to extract the value. So it's not saying more is better and it's not saying less is better. It's saying we want to optimize the supply, but also optimize the management. So we're using each space as efficiently as possible. Of course, every situation is unique. So there's no one rule or one method that's going to apply everywhere. So you're going to have to take what I'm presenting, some ideas that we're going to be talking about today, and figure out how they apply in Colwick. So this matrix compares the old and new paradigm. The old paradigm assumed, like I say, more is better. It assumed that transportation means driving and everybody's going to own a car and almost everybody's going to drive everywhere. So the old paradigm assumed that it was perfectly reasonable and fair to require everybody to pay for those free parking spaces based on the assumption that everybody's going to benefit. The new paradigm recognizes that our transportation system is actually quite diverse, multimodal, and that not everybody drives everywhere. And so it challenges the assumption that everybody should pay equally for parking, that parking should be subsidized. The old paradigm also minimized the regulations. And the new paradigm, it strives to prioritize parking. So it recognizes, for example, there are a lot of situations, well, the parking spaces that get the greatest demand, the really convenient parking space that's, say, in front of a building, in front of a business, or in a busy commercial district, those parking spaces are going to need much more regulation. So they're available. So you're maximizing turnover and you're making sure they're available to the higher value uses. And especially now, there's a lot of innovation going on in the transportation world. Things like ride hailing, so your Ubers and your Lyfts and delivery vehicles, as we've really discovered the importance of a pizza delivery or a UPS delivery van being able to find a parking space on every block so that that delivery can be made efficiently and easily. We're realizing that there's a great priority to things like curb management, to making sure that your on-street parking is regulated or priced to prioritize the higher value uses, the delivery vehicles, the passenger pickup and drop off, things like that. So that's kind of the general framework. And as mentioned, the old paradigm is actually inherently inefficient and unfair because it's assuming that more is always better and that free is always preferred. And if somebody doesn't own a car, they're essentially subsidizing the parking spaces of their neighbors under current practices, where we say is in order to build a house or in order to build or have a business, you have to have a certain number of parking spaces, and the cost of those are going to be embedded in your rent or your mortgage. That's forcing people that don't own a car or drive less than average to subsidize the parking of their neighbors who own more vehicles or drive more than average. So there are some kind of fundamental reasons to rethink the current policies. So as you'll see in this picture, I'm sure you've stared down at Colwood from a bird's eye view frequently enough. You know that especially in your commercial district, an awful lot of the land is devoted to parking. And so if you're a manager, if you're a planner or a manager, you ask, how can we use that more efficiently? How can we squeeze more value from each square meter of parking space? And if you can do that, you're really freeing up a valuable resource. You're essentially making more land available for other productive uses. If something like a quarter or a third of Colwood's commercial areas are devoted to parking, then anything that increases that the efficiency of the parking is freeing up land for other productive uses. So very briefly, you could say that more efficient management is beneficial because it saves money, it improves the user experience, it increases affordability, it can create more active and successful commercial centers, so more walkable shopping districts or malls. It supports local economic development, it encourages walking, bicycling, and public transit use, and it supports your environmental goals. So if we do the job right, if Colwood does its job right and squeezes more value from parking, you can achieve all of these benefits. Colwood is in the middle of a major study, a series of studies looking at what the people of Colwood, what your citizens think about and want to do in terms of parking problems. And you've probably seen the survey results and the analysis. These are just a couple glimpses of much more detailed analysis done by my good friends at Urban Systems. So as you can see, people are concerned about parking problems in Colwood. They also are hesitant. There's some hesitation about radical change. And so that's one of the areas, you just have to accept that some of the solutions might face some opposition at some point. I like to think that we can overcome a lot of that if we can use good arguments and provide evidence and develop the compromises that are needed so everybody feels like they're getting what they need. That's what this survey analysis is really all about. It's finding ways that can gain the public support.
Todd, can I
Yes.
just ask a question?
Yeah.
On both pages of the parking survey responses, what were the questions that elicited these responses?
Right. I'm going to have to go by memory. Maybe Ian. The thing is, it's in the documentation, so you can find this. And I just put these up just to give you the idea that there has been some surveying. And I wasn't actually expecting anybody to ask me the details. I was expecting you just to look at the highlights. I think the one on the left, I think that is a question related to the parking problems that people perceive. And I think the one on the right is a reference to some of the potential solutions or strategies that are being discussed in the report. But I'd have to go back to the document to get the exact wording.
Okay,
Through the
thank you.
chair to Councillor Baxter. The working paper number 2 that's attached to the off-street parking bylaw contains the questions, and I can share a link to that document with a page reference if that would be helpful.
No, I know where that document is. Thanks.
Yeah, I apologize for not being a little bit clearer. Anyway, my intent was simply just to bring up the idea that there has been a good deal of survey. This is I think the more fun way to look at it, and that is that the part of the process was to ask the big picture question: what should your community look like? To what degree do you want a walkable, pedestrian-focused urban villages and streets that prioritize walking and cycling? And unsurprisingly, people they put a high value on these quality of life or livability or placemaking. Sometimes we use the term placemaking design features. And again, for this workshop that we're going on right now, the key point is that where in the past the cities would specify the parking and then try and make them a little bit more attractive. Now, most communities are starting with more fundamental questions. How many parking spaces do we really need in a downtown area? How could we free up some of the land that's being devoted to parking for more green space? And what should it look like if we're going to have a nice pedestrian-oriented mixed-use village area where you're mixing, let's say you've got sidewalk cafes and wide sidewalks and other things going on. What can you do to make that happen? What needs to be done with the parking? To what degree are your current parking policies in conflict with this vision of a much more pedestrian-oriented commercial district? So, as I mentioned, about half, from what what I can determine, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of Colwood's commercial land is devoted to parking lots. And so, if, for example, if your local shopping mall could get by with 1/3 fewer parking spaces, that shopping mall could have another couple stores, restaurants in the same area. And so that's where you can, and because Colwood is fairly geographically constrained, it can't expand in all directions, and there are some good reasons to concentrate your commercial development in certain nodes in these urban villages. There's a lot of potential value from figuring out ways to use the existing parking facilities more efficiently. So you could squeeze more, you could say squeeze more value or squeeze more business activity, or from your perspective, you might be able to extract more tax revenue per hectare by using that parking land, that land more efficiently, the land is devoted to parking. Now, parking economics is interesting because almost everybody is a consumer of parking spaces, and most people pay for it, but very few people ever buy a parking space as a separate unit. Most of your parking facilities are what we call bundled with something else. They are the garage or the driveway when you buy a house, or they're the parking lot that comes with a commercial building that is just part of that building. And so most people have no idea what parking space actually costs. Now, if you're working in the field, if you start doing this analysis, frequently you say, "Wow." An urban parking space starts, if you account for the land and the construction and the operating costs, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars per space. So a lot of the parking spaces that people expect to get for free are actually worth more than the vehicle that parks there. You might have a $20,000 vehicle that's parking in a $40,000 space. And because zoning codes require parking at your house and your business and at your stores that you visit and many other places that you are going to travel to, there are typically 3 to 6 off-street parking spaces per car, per vehicle. And so the total sum of the value of all those parking spaces that we supply per vehicle is generally greater than the value of that vehicle. Every time somebody buys a car, every time somebody spends $1 on a car, they're expecting somebody, usually somebody else, to spend $1 to pay for parking for that car. So of course, it's highly variable. If you have a piece of property and it's got a corner of that is wasted land, you're not using it for anything else, then you can say, oh, I can park a vehicle there and it costs me nothing. On the other hand, if you're building a new building, and let's say you want to maximize the number of apartments that you can put on a hectare of land, or you want to, your business is growing and there are more employees, you want to accommodate, you currently have 50 employees and you want to be able to accommodate 100 employees, then adding parking spaces under those circumstances can be very costly, and literally $50,000 per space if you're going underground. So there are good reasons to try and extract the value. I mean, roughly, I typically say that a parking space annualized cost, if you were to pay the full rent for a parking space, it wasn't subsidized, so you were recovering the full cost. It's typically $1,000 to $2,000 a year would be the annualized cost, including the land and the construction and the operating expenses. But it can go much higher if you're talking about underground parking. So there's been a whole bunch of research just in the last few years, looking at how well parking spaces are being used. So what we call the utilization rate, and how many parking spaces are underutilized. So, if you have a parking lot and maybe it has space for 100 vehicles, and you could ask, could we get by with fewer spaces? Could we free up some of that land? And you can look at a lot of parking spaces and there's no evidence that it's ever that particular space, the spaces out at the outer corners are used more than a couple times a year. And so there's been a lot of research asking, what's the ratio between the supply and demand or the ratio between the zoning codes, the minimum parking requirements mandated by your zoning codes, and the actual demand, how many spaces people actually need. And there's some numbers I can throw around. One study came up with it. It estimated that excess surface parking, so just the regular little parking lot at a typical, say, commercial building, adds $2 per foot to the leasing costs, and can add $7 per square foot if you're talking about a garage, so structured parking. And if you're trying to deliver affordable housing, requiring one parking space typically adds, say, 12% to the cost of that that affordable unit. And if you require 2 parking spaces per unit, it can increase the cost by 1/4. Now, that's particularly striking because car ownership, automobile ownership increases with wealth. And there's a large number of low-income households that are car-free. So the current zoning codes essentially says that even if you're a low-income car-free household, you're still forced to spend a good portion of your rent paying for parking spaces that you don't need. So that's one of the areas that there's getting a lot of interest. Another area that's getting a lot of interest is looking at curbs. It turns out curb space is one of the most valuable resources that your city controls. It was one of these epiphanies when people started talking about curb space, because we usually take curbs for granted. And yet, if you think of and that's part of the city's valuable road right of way. So the city owns the curb, it owns the street. And so you can ask, what's the prioritization for your curbs? With things like Uber and Lyft, so ride hailing and delivery vehicles, and also the need for emergency vehicles and public transit vehicles and bicycle lanes and bus lanes. There's been an awful lot of discussion among transportation professionals about how to think about curbs. So that's probably going to be another area that you at Colwood Council will want to pay attention to, is asking what are the priorities for curbs. As I mentioned, in a typical community, there are 3 to 6 off-street government mandated parking spaces per vehicle. And these are costly. And as I mentioned, the total value of those parking spaces is often greater than the value of the car, of the vehicle. One of the things we're trying to do in our parking planning is to ask, what are our goals, and to what degree will a particular solution to a parking problem help achieve various goals? For example, which parking solutions generate revenue, or help reduce traffic congestion, or save consumers money, or increase affordability, or are helping people who don't drive, people who rely on walking and bicycling and public transit, or achieve your traffic safety or your energy conservation and emission reduction goals, or your strategic development goals, your vision of what your Colwood commercial centers should look like, or your public fitness and health. So we can analyze a particular strategy. If somebody proposes, for example, metering your on-street parking or regulating your curbs in a new way, one of the things you might want to do is develop a framework for looking at the consistency between that particular solution and some of your strategic goals. So there are a large number of these management strategies, and I'm going to give a really quick overview. There's an awful lot of detail about each of them. If you do ever want to become a planning professional, I can assure you this is job security for professional planners, is to become an expert in parking management, because parking is one of those issues that it's never going to disappear. There's always going to be some need for better parking management. So, like I say, various strategies. One of the first is more accurate standards. So you're saying, instead of requiring, let's say, and I haven't actually looked at Colwood's zoning codes, but if you're a typical suburban community, you're probably requiring at least 1 parking space per apartment, and either 1.5 or 2 parking spaces per townhouse, and typically 2 parking spaces per single family detached house. And there are many cities are beginning to adjust these and develop adjustment factors that get incorporated in your parking requirements. So you would say, okay, we're going to require 2 parking spaces for a single family house if it's in an isolated area, but that goes down to 1 if it's in one of the really walkable neighborhoods or located near a transit stop. Or you could have adjustment factors for example, if there's car share services on site, or bicycling facilities, or if it's a building designed for seniors or low income people, or if you're more efficiently pricing the parking, or if you have a parking and transportation management plan. So for example, the zoning code might say that a particular office building would need 100 parking spaces. For that size of office building, the default is 100 parking spaces. But you'd say, but if you implement a commute trip reduction program, you can reduce that from 100 to, let's say, 50, as long as you have a contingency plan that identifies how you would deal with overflow parking if that's occasionally a problem. So there are ways that you can adjust your parking minimums, and cities all over the world are doing this. Now, an important point is that reducing or eliminating parking minimums does not necessarily eliminate parking. It simply allows the developer or the property manager to determine how many parking spaces they need based on market demands. It's just not the city determining that. And what we typically find is that when we allow developers to determine their own parking, you get small reductions in the high price market, but you get big reductions in the affordable housing market. It turns out, especially if you're trying to deliver affordable housing, you can do a lot by applying reduced or more flexible or even eliminating their parking minimums. Another strategy is to figure out how to share those parking spaces. So let's say you've got a church that needs its parking lot primarily on the weekends, on Sundays, and for some evening activity. And it's located near a restaurant or a bar, and their peak is during the evenings or during the lunch hour. And so if the church and the restaurant can make an agreement, they can share their parking. And you can go through a commercial district and you can identify a whole bunch of overlapping opportunities for sharing. Let me just show you, this is, an overhead shot of one of your commercial districts. And if you look carefully, you'll see there's a lot of parking lots that at the moment this photo was taken, they were virtually empty. And if you can figure out a way to use, to share, to make those spaces available, that commercial district could get by with far fewer spaces. So maybe the church makes its parking spaces available to the employees of the restaurant. So now some of the spaces that were previously used by employees are now available to customers, and the employees now have to walk a block. Okay, in order for all that to work, you do need to pay attention to things like the regulations and the insurance liability and the walkability and the signage. You need some signs that say when this parking lot is full, there's some overflow parking around the corner. It requires a little bit of planning, but it can sure save a lot of resource. It can sure deliver a lot of value if you can do this right. And so there are some ways that cities can assist the property owners in this kind of in strategies like shared parking, so they're able to use the parking resources more efficiently. Okay, so here's another related issue, and that's there are a lot of situations where a parking lot is really sized for an occasional peak. Maybe once a month, there'll be some event that attracts a lot of customers or a lot of visitors. And so rather than oversize the parking lot, you could say we'll have some overflow parking. We're going to have a sign that says when this parking lot is full, here's where you go next. And people are accustomed to that as long as it's well planned. So you've got the signage and you've got the walkability and you've got the legal arrangement, then that's perfectly doable. In order for all this to work, you need good user information. The key point, when you're, say, driving someplace, there's a key point where you need that information. Where can I park? Frequently, what I find is there's plenty of parking. It's just that people don't know that it's available. It may be around the corner or a block away. So your Callwood's maps and websites and visitor information and roadway signs and the brochure that or the, let's say a medical clinic or a whatever, some small business, they should have some information that identifies where people who are visiting that destination can park. And with some details that says something like, if you're going to be parking for a short time, if you're just running a quick errand at our restaurant or store, you can park right in front. But if you're going to be a leisure diner and you're going to be there for 3 or 4 hours, or you're going to be visiting a dental clinic for a long time or something like that, that the more long-term parking is the less convenient. The more convenient spaces should be reserved for the high value short-term users, and the less convenient spaces should be used for the longer-term users. That's the kind of information people need, and they'll need it at that point where they're making their decision. So it's up to it's up to the business and it's up to the city to determine how you get that information to people when they need it. And I do notice, for example, Callwood's website has information on how to get around, but there's nothing about parking. And I think that reflects your current situation, which is you're a typical suburban community with where you're assuming that most businesses, most destinations are going to have plenty of parking. And maybe it's time to start thinking about a coordinated parking management program and figuring out ways that you're going to get that information to people at that moment when they're making that decision, when they're pulling into Callwood Center, or they're planning their trip to one of Callwood's commercial centers or something like that. A related issue is improving walkability. So if you want people to park off-site, you have to pay attention to parking or to walkability. If you want them to be able to walk a block or two between where they park their car and their destination, then it needs to be excellent walkability. Now, currently, Callwood has what's ranks as moderate walkability, but in the commercial areas, if you look at the walk score map, you'll see that some of your areas are yellow and even green, indicating a fairly good walkability. It's going to be, and my point is that when you do your parking planning, you want to integrate that with walkability planning, so you are accommodating that need. There are some situations where you can free up parking spaces, car parking spaces, by encouraging people to use non-auto modes. Callwood, I know, has a bicycle, fairly strong bicycle plan underway, and that's one way to free up some spaces. encouraging commuters to use public transportation, especially in those locations where you do have your maximum parking demand or maximum parking conflicts. That makes a lot of sense. One way to organize all this is to create what we call a transportation management association, or sometimes it's a parking brokerage or parking management association. The point is, if you want the businesses in, let's say, a shopping district, a mall or shopping district, to coordinate their parking, to share their parking, to share the information, to be available for overflow parking, it's best if those businesses all work together, if they have a coordinated program, which you could call a transportation management association. Sometimes these are led by your local chamber of commerce. Sometimes they're led by the city, the municipal government. Sometimes there's a big employer, say a shopping mall or a hospital, and they take the lead, and then they bring on other smaller businesses. So, there are a number of things that a business can do to manage its parking more efficiently. These become more effective and efficient if you get lots of little partners involved, not just the big ones. So in the past, a lot of parking management programs, they focused only on the big employers. They would be for the businesses that had more than 50 employees or something like that. But what we realize is that all these programs, things like encouraging ride sharing or making sure that there's a really good quality bicycle parking or promoting public transit, it becomes more effective if you also get the smaller businesses to be part of this pool of parking management and transportation management. So that's where organizing a transportation management association in a particular commercial district makes a lot of sense. There's also a lot that employers can do to encourage their employees to use the most efficient form of transportation: carpooling, bicycle encouragement, public transit incentives. All of these work together. Of course, part of the municipal role is to set the regulations. You should be constantly asking yourself, what are the priorities? What are the most important, best users of each parking space? Who should have the highest use? And you can use regulations. You can say this parking space is for delivery vehicles or passenger pickup and drop off, or for short errands. And you can do that either by regulating the type of user. So you could say, if you've got people with disabilities or delivery vehicles, or you can do it based on time. You can say this parking space is only for under 10-minute duration parking, or you can do it with price. You could say this is going to be 10 cents per 5 minutes or something like that. And you're giving people, if they're going to be parking longer periods, you're giving them an incentive to use the less convenient parking spaces. And I know Colwood is already doing some of this. I'm not suggesting I'm inventing this, but it is time, it is useful occasionally to step back and ask yourself, what are we trying to do? What are the priorities, and how can we apply that in this particular situation? Many cities use pricing. Pricing has several advantages over just regulation. For one thing, it generates some revenue, and that revenue can be used in all kinds of useful ways. Some cities dedicate parking revenue to neighborhood improvements or transportation improvements, or you could use it, say, as a downtown business association funding source or something like that. The key starting point is to recognize there really is no free parking, except maybe in the game of Monopoly. The choice is really between paying for that parking directly or indirectly. And paying for it directly is actually more efficient and equitable because it means that if you don't drive, you're not forced to pay for a space you don't need. And it does give people an incentive to use the more efficient alternatives. It means, for example, that some people, if parking is priced, then some people who would have driven will say, no, I'm going to bicycle, or I'm going to take the bus. So there's an efficiency gain, a potential efficiency gain from efficient pricing. You also want to spend some time addressing negative impacts. Parking facilities are often unattractive and they have stormwater management impacts. They're a surface that builds up a lot of heat, what we call the heat island effect. There are design approaches that you can mitigate some of those impacts. You can apply green space. You can deal with the stormwater. You can have on-site stormwater. You can have better regulations and enforcement. You can have require some landscaping. And in some situations, you're figuring out ways to compensate. If there's some unavoidable impacts from a parking lot, you can figure out ways that the people who are impacted can be, the neighbors that are impacted can get some compensation. As part of this, you need to pay a lot of attention to your enforcement. If you're going to have regulations, you need to enforce it. Your enforcement needs to be responsive, it needs to be effective, and it needs to be considerate. Ideally, people would come away from having some sort of enforcement interaction and say, boy, Colwood is a friendly place. For example, you can have a policy that says your first interaction with your parking enforcement is a warning, but we're going to record that, your license number, and if you do violate the law the next time, you're going to get charged. Or there are other ways to make it a more positive experience. This is a good time to start thinking into the future. So asking yourself, what should your transportation system and therefore your parking management look like in a decade or two, when there may be more ride hailing, when you're making your downtown or your commercial centers more mixed use, you're positioning Colwood as a retirement destination or as an affordable community area. And all of those changes in your demographics and the economics and the transportation policies can all have implications for your parking policies. So when you get started on this, or as you're working on your parking policies, step back and be thinking about what are the demands and what are the fundamental underlying demographic and economic changes and technological changes. I mean, one little detail is that when you ask people why they don't want to pay for parking, why they become upset when you install a parking meter, it's not the money, it's the inconvenience. It's the frustration of having to go out there and feed a meter and some uncertainty because you're not sure how many minutes you've got left. There are some new technologies that make it really convenient to charge for parking. And if Colwood starts planning now for best state-of-the-art technology, you can implement parking pricing with these new convenient technologies. And that could be part of your parking management plan, is making sure that all the components are there to maximize user convenience. So there are some basic principles for efficient parking management. One is that you want to make sure you're providing convenient information to motorists about where they can park and what their options are. Only build as much parking as you need. If you can, price for cost recovery. So have as much as possible. You could have motorists pay directly for the parking. You could what a lot of parking programs are now doing is have varying price. So you have a higher price at the busy times or the busy locations, and discounted at the less busy, or it can be free. So basically what you're saying is, if you're going to be parking for a long time, if you have an urgent errand, then we're guaranteeing you there's going to be a parking space for you, as long as you're willing to pay for it. But if you want to leave your vehicle for a longer period, or you want to save money, you should choose the less convenient space that might be a block or two away. And so that's the efficient pricing. And so this allows motorists to choose between the convenient but more expensive and the cheaper but less convenient parking spaces, and that increases efficiency. One little detail is the old parking meters, they required you to commit to a certain amount of time. Some of the new technologies, they only charge you for the number of minutes that you're actually parked, and they'll automatically reset as soon as your vehicle pulls out of the spot. And of course, the new systems, they're paid by phone or paid by credit card or debit card, or they're much more, they're using electronic technologies to be much more efficient. Okay, so that is getting toward the end. Let me just say very briefly, pretty much every professional organization that I work with, transportation and land use planning communities, development communities, innovative transportation, they're all looking at ways to use parking more efficiently. So these ideas that I'm talking about, they're widely supported by pretty much everybody who's working on urban planning and transportation planning. Your Colwood's parking program, as you know, includes this Let's Talk Parking website and the documents that are there. So sort of in closing, what I would, the questions that I think we could be discussing, if I'll leave it to you, I'll leave it to Ian and you to decide, but some of the things that you might want to be discussing is what, when, and where does Colwood have a parking problem? And how might this change in the future with population and economic and business growth and changes in travel demands, changes in the way people are going to get around in communities like Colwood? How does parking management fit into the city's long-term vision? And what data are you going to need? So this is the time when you can start asking things like, how much land, how many parking spaces really are there in Colwood? And who owns those parking spaces? And what are the regulations and the prices? And what's the value of that land that's used for parking? And how many vehicle trips or how much are they being used? What are changes in the travel activity that's occurring? Is there growth or leveling off or declines in the number of car trips going to some of your commercial districts and things like that? So I think I'm gonna turn it over to Ian, right? By the way, if you want more information on my parking management, you can visit our website, Victoria Transport Policy Institute. But I'm going to leave this screen up and turn it over, I guess, to Ian or whoever wants to lead the discussion.
Yeah, so this is Doug here. I'll just open up the floor to council right now for questions, any questions or comments. Councilor Baxter.
Yeah, so Todd, you mentioned traffic management associations, if I've got that right, transportation management associations. I assume that it's necessary to put rules in our parking bylaw and possibly in rezonings to encourage and possibly to allow the creation of these TMAs. Would that be correct?
Right. In fact, I would start off with a meeting with your Chamber of Commerce or other the other partners that you're going to, in fact, it would probably be BC Transit and your local business association and maybe some developers or other property managers. And what you're asking is, what would it look like? What's the institutional framework so that you could implement some of these parking management strategies in a particular location? Keep in mind, an organization like BC Transit, they're going to promote transit ridership. That's great, but they're not geographically concentrated. Where the businesses at, let's say, Colwood Corners, or at some specific area, they have an interest in. They're going to focus on exactly that area. And so that's what you want to help create, is some organization that can provide those management services in that particular location. What do you think? Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
So there may be some bylaws associated with it, but I would start it off as a discussion with potential stakeholders.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And you talked about it works best if people pay the cost of parking, as it generally does in almost anything. If people pay the cost of what they're using, they use it more appropriately. So we have systems for charging cars for the amount of actual time they use. And pedestrians don't have to pay for parking, but they generally pay for the bus to get them there. But bicycles don't, at the moment that I see, pay anything. And I have a bicycle as my means of transportation. Has anybody worked out how to charge bicycles an appropriate amount for the parking facilities that are created for bicycles?
Well, it would be straightforward. And actually, there are situations, some park and ride lots have bicycle lockers. And some of them are priced. So you pay, you rent a bicycle locker at, say, $10 or $20 per month. So it's not unheard of, and it's perfectly doable. But keep in mind that bicycle parking space costs to produce this space. It's going to be somewhere between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than a space for a car. And so very likely you're in the range where it just isn't worth the transaction costs. Or to put it differently, the last thing you'd want is for somebody who, when they're trying to decide whether to hop on their bike or hop in their car when they're going to run an errand in your commercial district, that the cost of parking their bike convinces them to drive instead. So there are some pretty good reasons to make sure that bicycling and public transit are the more convenient and more financially attractive option, at least until we do charge everybody everybody the cost recovery parking. What would not make sense is to charge bicycles and not charge cars for their use.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But let me fly a couple of reasons why, if you are charging for cars, then you should also charge for bicycles. And one reason is it makes the charge for the car more acceptable to the car driver if the bicycle is also paying his way. But I think you're right, you have to make each one an accurate charge, a realistic charge for what is actually being consumed. And the other reason for charging for both at the same time is that it's a wonderful demonstration of the vast difference in cost. It might actually persuade more people to bike because they see that huge difference in cost.
Sure. These are the kind of interesting decisions that you as a council will have to make. And I certainly agree. I mean, the basic principle is people should get what they pay for and pay for what they get. And so, you know, if you were setting up this universal payment system that is has minimum transaction costs, you know, it seems perfectly reasonable to charge for bicycles as well as cars. But just keep in mind that there is a point where it's just not worth the transaction cost. So, you know, setting up the meter at each bicycle parking space may cost more than you would ever recover. So that's the kind of thing, if you're planning it strategically, sure. You know, if you're setting up Colwood's parking payment system and it's going to be a standardized system and it's going to be, you know, minimum transaction costs, then sure, you could, there's no reason you couldn't include bicycles there.
And I agree. That's the difficulty. That's the difficulty in my mind, is how do you make that transaction cost as small as possible?
Well, that's where, the new technologies are kind of magical. You can have, for example, you can have RFID payments where your mobile phone or a little card automatically deducts, you know, it's all electronic payments and it's automated. So it knows when you pull into the parking space, charges you so many cents per minute. And then as soon as you pull away, it stops charging you for that space. I mean, that's doable. And if you're planning it strategically, you can go to the vendors and say, this is what we're going to apply. And you can mandate it. You could say every, you know, both private and public parking spaces will use the same technology. So it's all very doable, but you'll want to start planning for it so you do have the best current technology.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Councillor Parkinson?
Thanks, Chair. Interesting stuff. Thank you for this, Todd. My sort of experience on this is really vicarious through my brother, who lives in Kitsilano in Vancouver. And he lived there for 15 years without a car. He only bought a car when it was time for his kids to learn to drive. But what he did was he worked downtown and he could walk, down to the end of the block, and there was multiple buses going by every minute or two into downtown to whisk him into downtown and home quicker than he could have driven. So that made sense. And he had a grocery store and a liquor store and a pharmacist and some restaurants within a block or two of his house. That worked perfect. Obviously, a long time before Colwood gets there. We're a suburban community, as you mentioned. We've got, 40 or 60 years worth of development on our books as we sit today before we start redeveloping some of this stuff. So it's how do we make sure we don't put the cart before the horse? Like, we can't implement downtown Vancouver solutions today and expect success. Your comments about get a good parking management system that works and start it now so people get used to it. I buy into that a lot, but things that are workable when you have a lot of choice to owning your own car or two in a family aren't appropriate in Colwood just yet, in my opinion. That we have to be careful. And if we have a little extra parking here and there, in 20 or 30 years, somebody will figure out what to do with that once these things come in. So it's just how we sort of transition from you're right, building parking for the peak usage to building stuff that may be more appropriate, but not for 30 or 40 years. And it's that I think we as a council have to be very, very careful with.
Well, yes, I will totally agree. Every household or every person and every geographic location is unique. and there is no blanket solution. But what I can tell you is that there are the current trends, trends in planning and the current demographic trends are toward creating what I like to call walkable urban villages. And Colwood does have some of those, and could conceivably have a lot more within just 5 or 10 years. You could imagine, for example, actually some parts of Colwood, and certainly the center of Langford, are building large numbers, literally hundreds of moderate priced apartment units every year. I haven't looked at the numbers in Colwood, but Langford is certainly Langford's downtown is becoming a walkable urban center, and with innovations like not just bicycles but e-bikes are greatly expanding the number of people who can get around by bicycle. And what we're seeing is in Colwood, it might not be a choice between, there might not be many households that are going to be car free, but there could be a lot of households that are going from owning 2 cars, so 1 car for every adult, to 1 car that's shared by 2 or 3 adults. And that increases that, and the basic principles still apply. So you could say, for example, if Colwood does create some of these urban villages, then some retirees might move in that don't own a car, or some lower income families might move in where there's 1 car, say 2 kids, and they're going to share 1 car, and they're going to rely a lot on walking and bicycling for getting around. So I guess my main message is look forward, not backward, and make sure that whatever your vision for Colwood going in the next decade or so is that your parking policies support that. So if you do want to build a lot more affordable housing, or you do want to create mixed use urban villages where you've got housing and stores and schools all close together, then your parking policies should be designed to support that. What do you think? Does that respond to your?
Sure. Yeah, no. A great discussion, and granted, I get you, and I think as a council, and we do want to create some of these nice walkable village centers type of thing, and we will over some length of time. It's just whether we adjust our parking requirements to reflect reality as it changes, or whether we try to use them to coerce a vision that we have that may or may not relate to the marketplace. And your example of Langford creating a downtown, which they have, and they've done deliberately to try and do that, to create the vibrant downtown. But all those apartments they're building aren't all downtown and walkable, so a lot of the apartments they're building in Langford, people are still going to drive to downtown Langford, or some way. And Uber and Lyft will come, I guess, at some point. They're certainly not viable, I don't think, in Colwood today, but we suspect that'll come quicker than some of the other things.
Right. The point I want to emphasize is that for the city to eliminate its minimum parking requirements does not eliminate parking. It's simply allowing the developers to determine how many parking spaces they have. Let me put it this way, that if you require a generous amount of parking, so if Colwood applies standard parking minimums, you give the developers and the businesses no incentive to support parking management. If your zoning code, let's say somebody's building an office building for a hundred that's going to house 100 employees. And if the zoning code says that that office building needs 100 parking spaces, 1 parking space per employee, then the business that rents that space has no incentive to encourage their employees to use non-auto modes, because if they're successful, some of those very costly parking spaces will simply sit unoccupied. That would seem wasteful to them. But if the developer is allowed to optimize parking based on demands, that 100 employee office building might only get 50 parking spaces, because that's the amount that that use actually demands. And so that developer now has some resources to put into things like bicycle parking facilities and car rental services and other and commute trip reduction programs. So I'm certainly not saying Colwood's gonna that the good people of Colwood are gonna stop driving and stop owning cars, but there's good reasons to build in flexibility and responsiveness to demand. That's what parking management allows you to do.
Yeah, true. I see that, and I understand that. Support that, but you know, your example is a little convoluted, because there's 3 parties involved. There's city that sets the regulations. There's a developer who comes along and says, "I'm going to build this office building, and look, I've got this great scheme to reduce the need for parking." And then there's the tenants coming later on. And the trouble is that if the tenants don't buy into, or the scheme of the developer that he used to reduce his parking doesn't work, it's the city left holding the bag. And that's just my concern, is that we don't want to be in a situation where, oh my gosh, this didn't work, everybody's got to park on the street, and the city takes the heat for that. So I mean, just has to be done carefully, and I'm not opposed to it. I'm just not. I guess I'm not going to lead the pack and rush into the burning fire to start with. I'll leave that to you and Ian. You guys are more suited to that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much, Councillor Parkinson. Councillor Jensen. You're muted, Dean. Okay.
Yeah, I had to find the button. Sorry, Doug. This is an interesting discussion, and I love some of the stuff that's coming up. But further to Councillor Parkinson's point, I would add there's a fourth interest, Stuart, in your example there, and that's the existing surrounding neighborhoods that would be impacted, where the mark has been missed. I find it troublesome to think that we would leave this to the developers. The next thing you know, it's our typical numbered company that's changed hands a bunch of times, and some murky group running it that disappears into the ether as soon as the building's up, and nobody cares. And we are holding the bag. The example that Councillor Parkinson describes, and I think there's examples where the mark has been missed within our community, luckily in a small scale. But I think that we are seeing examples of parking pressures in Langford. Regardless of what we think, the economic opportunities for our constituents and our residents are largely elsewhere outside the community. So this will be a suburban commuting community for another generation at least. And because of that, I think the risk to getting it wrong is so much greater than the risk to err on the side of a few extra parking spaces. So those are some of my thoughts. I guess there's no real question in there. There's just commentary. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? So I do have a comment or question here, Todd. And I guess this is, you're changing my paradigm. I'm that old paradigm, that's for darn sure. And, we just went through, a few meetings where we've discussed, parking and, and what we get presented to us is data where we compare one city against another city and we come up with these ratios and really part of the solution is this whole parking management, I think, because it's been brought up sort of indirectly, but not directly. Where we're offering solutions because we can't just sort of say, well, they're getting 1-to-1 and that's it. Who cares? They're going to have to figure it out, because I always feel that I'm in that predicament. And the arguments rightfully so, we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases and all that. But I always feel this pressure that the way that we get the information presented right now is it is analytical in that they do comparisons. This town is similar to ours and the conditions are the same, and then we come up with these ratios and we approve it, and then the citizens get mad at us because we didn't think of this and we didn't think of this. So I guess what my question comes down to is, I guess what you're saying is that we should have a parking management plan going alongside with this, correct? Is that what I'm understanding? Because the parking management plan we have right now, I don't know if I'm not aware of a formal parking management plan. I mean, have we actually, I guess this is a question for Ian, have we actually defined the problem ourselves per the slide?
Mr. Chair, I'll just bring the committee's attention to the resolution that was provided in response to the on-street parking report that directed staff to prepare options for a parking management system. So that's something that we'll be working on at council's direction. And I'd point the committee to the draft parking bylaw in that it incorporates an attempt at right-sizing the minimum parking requirements to our growth centers and our transit growth areas, in terms of those areas having a lower parking requirement, as well as the parking variance policy that allows for different characteristics of the site to be taken into consideration for up to 10% of the parking spaces to be reduced or to a maximum of 10 spaces. So in that sense, there are some strategic responses to these best practices that are brought forth today.
But then I guess my question, Ian, is we are simply applying a solution. We're just reducing parking. But if there's no plan around it, like giving us all the multimodal transportation and how this is all going to solve the reduction, then all we're doing is we're just adding fuel to the fire, are we not? So to me, after seeing this presentation, I got a bigger picture of how we can solve this and how it could be sold. But right now, just by going in and saying, okay, we're thinking about this and therefore we're reducing by 10%, I don't think that's adequate, just in my opinion.
Yeah, to maybe clarify my initial comment or response, the on-street parking policy that council has asked staff to create options for would be the counterpoint to the challenges that we could potentially face if there's not enough parking required for a use that, let's say that office building has a tenant that generates more parking than is provided on site. We're having those spillover challenges. The on-street parking policy that council has asked staff to develop would address those issues and it would behoove us to address the best practices, as I said, that were presented by Mr. Littman today.
Okay, fair enough, Ian. That's fair. Okay, thank you. Councillor Baxter?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, Doug, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I couldn't see myself approving a new parking bylaw that didn't provide for the sort of forward planning and the change over time that we've talked about here, and particularly that Todd has talked about. I'm not automatically against the reductions in parking provision we've discussed, but on their own, they're merely coercive and they're not productive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, any other questions, comments for Todd? Well, we still have them. Okay, on that note, I'd not seen any. Todd, at this time, I'd just like to, on behalf of the committee, just thank you very much for an extremely informative presentation. This is the first time I've ever seen something like this, and I've learned a bunch of new words and terminology now, and I love being educated. It's one of the reasons I like sitting on council. But so I've learned a lot here. Certainly has given me things to think about, and sure I can speak on behalf of fellow councillors that it certainly has been extremely informative. Again, just like to thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak to us today. It was a great presentation.
Thank you very much. So, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me if they want more detailed information about anything I presented.
Great, thank you very much, Todd. Okay, on that note, we are finished. I don't think there's any businesses here right now, so I was gonna jump in on and maybe just extend the session, but seeing no other businesses here. The next meeting of the Economic Prosperity Committee is scheduled not until September 13th, Monday. So, just looking for a motion of adjournment. Is that you, Councillor Jansen? See you all tonight. Thank you.